What I found here in Denver was I used to promote, hey, rent my house and you have the lock and leave lifestyle. And what happened during the downturn all over America is you had a bunch of people lose their job quickly. And all of a sudden they had this mortgage and they were trying to find a new job. But the problem is maybe they had to change industries or move to a new city. And a lot of the new jobs were in the Southeast. They weren't here in the West. And so what happened here in Denver is those people became accidental landlords where they would find somebody, they would rent the house just for the mortgage payment, just so they didn't have to take a loss. Now, Denver's market snapped back really quickly. The downturn was only 18 months. There's some parts of America where they're still trying to get back to where they were before 2008. Like, and that's where you really have to pay attention to where the jobs are, because that's where people are moving. And so when I would interview my tenants, when I was managing everything myself, I would say, why are you moving?
Yeah.
And the number one reason was, well, my landlord's selling the property. And it
Hmm.
was they called it the shadow market, where all these accidental landlords were like, oh, good, we don't have to take a loss. Let's get out of this since we've moved to Atlanta or we've moved to LA or wherever they went. And so that's been a difficult thing for the housing market because all those accidental landlords were my competition as well, even though I was doing this as my career, my vocation. And that's one thing I like about Jacksonville is that these are the tenants usually have grown up in these neighborhoods and they have a culture there that keeps them there. They appreciate it. They're aware of what the amenities are. And the best amenity is a good neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
That's what
Leslie,
we don't have in Detroit, unfortunately.
Leslie, you mentioned something in there that is part of the reason why we wanted to talk to you here, but it's you have made this your career, right? Like I feel like I look around whenever I get to talk to you, you're like, oh yeah, well, I just finished this trip and then I'm about to go on this other trip. So I got some time right now. So you're living that like super maximized out, like retired lifestyle early on already. You figured it out. And that means that you don't have conventional sources of financing like most folks. Like you've been creative about the way that, get your capital to invest in this stuff. And I want to talk to you about that, but I want to talk to you about it in relation to the most recent wave of properties that you bought, right? Like you were just talking about these macro conditions that you really like. That's what brought you here first. You talked about the trust factor, which was listening to the show. But I understand that you've picked up a couple of properties recently. And the before we get into like how you got the cash for it, why now? Like, why are you buying, back to the title of the show, what is it about right now that made you want to buy more properties as opposed to the ones that you were just already liquidating somewhere else?
Well, I think the first thing, what I learned from Harry Dent, the demographer, is to look at each decade. And he talks about the cycles of business in a decade. And usually, as you're approaching a new decade, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the first 2 years, America usually goes into a recession because business are like, oh, we have a new administration. We're not sure. Business does not like chaos and uncertainty. They like predictability. And so I'm always a little careful around the beginning of a new decade. Well, now we're in a new decade. We're 2024. And that historically has been the go go appreciation time for the American economy. Now, this year's a little different. We've got a really big election coming up, and there is still a lot of uncertainty. But when I watch what the economic policies are in America and what the Fed has done, and you and Greg have been promoting, say, hey, interest rates are going to come down. They're not always going to be this high. I responded to Greg's incentive to help people pay down their interest rate. And I was able to close this most recent purchase at 5.25%. And that's the highest rental property interest rate that I have. Most of mine are like 3.5, 4.25. So it was just enough of a nudge to say, okay. And how I financed this is I took out a home equity line of credit because my house in Denver has appreciated so much, I often refer to that excess value as dead equity. So I always want to keep it working. So I took a home equity line of credit and I'm paying 6.25% on that. So I went and got the down payment there. And then Greg introduced me to Patriot Lending, where they had a new product where you can finance the property based on the financials of that property. Because I've been doing this as my vocation, my tax return's like 2 inches thick. I have to have a Schedule E for every single property. And to go through a traditional mortgage, which that's the only mortgage I've ever done because I'm really cheap when it comes to interest rates, it takes them like 30 days even to put me into the computer. And a lot of times they discount the rental income you have. It's a hassle. Well, then this year I struggled because my accountant hadn't finished up my 2023 tax return. So I was kind of prevented from jumping in. And Patriot Lending said, Leslie, don't even bother with those tax returns. So it really, I was able to close within 30 days. So it made it really smooth. And the other thing is that I was able to close in an LLC, which in traditional financing, you're not able to do. And so that also was attractive to me to do a little asset protection as well as get another rental property.
Amazing. So many things that I think people would love to learn more about just in that sentence right there.
Before you go, I want you to teach, but I also I know that there's a lot of folks, like for me, a lot of that goes over my head.
Yeah.
Right.
I was going to ask her to
and
clarify.
I know you're going to break some of that down. I just want to say that the easy button is what you heard is essentially there is certain products that most people don't know about as far as like lending goes. There's certain mechanisms that you can tap into, and the JWB team is an expert at that, right? So that's why we have that number on that screen, that 904-293-0341. This is that call to action of like, Leslie just painted a really pretty picture of macroeconomic factors, these other things that are happening here locally as well. And then all these opportunities most people don't realize they have access to. So if you have a question on how this might work for you that you're not so sure, go ahead and text 904-293-0341. Ask that question, and they can just kind of get you started on that. But GC, why don't you?
Well said. And, I should also point out, and Leslie, I'm sure would agree, Leslie's sitting here now, and she owns seven properties now with JWB, right, Leslie?
Yep.
7 properties, right? And she was able to add more, and you can see that there's challenges. There's challenges with banks don't understand how rental properties actually produce income, which is try explaining that to a bank. They don't get it. So there's all these challenges. Leslie didn't come to JWB, especially on this last purchase, and say, oh, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this DSCR product. I'm going to close in an LLC. I'm going to do this, do that, do this. She just called up JWB, and we have a wonderful relationship. And she said, I'm ready to move. I understand this is a good time for me to buy. What do I do? And so for anybody who is kind of in that spot where you're like, I know I want to do this, but I don't know how to do it, that's when you should text that number.
Yeah.
That's exactly where Leslie was. And then through this conversation, we're going to be able to help you do that. Is that pretty accurate, Leslie?
Yeah, and the call is free. You don't charge.
Right. Right. So there were a couple of things that I think people at first glance say, whoa, I don't know if I want to do that. So I wanted to dive a little bit into it a couple of times. So you had 2, and this was going from your Denver properties, and I believe your primary residence as well, 2 rentals in Denver. I believe you did a cash out refinance for both of those as well as the primary. So
Correct.
You took out more debt. And one of the scariest things for people to do is to take out debt on their primary residence to use it for investment purposes. But you are comfortable doing that. Can you talk to people who would say to you, I would never do that, and explain why it makes sense for you to do that and potentially help others?
I think the most important lesson I learned was there's different kinds of debt. Debt is not all one thing. There's good debt and there's bad debt. It's still called debt. So taking out a home equity line of credit to take a fancy vacation, to buy a depreciating asset like a car, that's bad debt. Taking out a home equity line of credit to invest in good debt, which would be an appreciating rental property in Jacksonville, Florida, that will just grow over time. So that was the first thing that I had to learn of not all debt is created equal. you also hear that, oh, I just want to be debt free. And I experienced that in 2010. I paid off every mortgage because my father had passed away and I'd loaded him up with life insurance. So I received an inheritance that was tax free. So I paid off everything and thought, oh, I'm grieving. I had taken care of him the last 7 years of his life. I was exhausted. He had dementia. So I just wanted to like sit for a minute. Then I got my federal income tax bill, and it was the highest that I'd ever paid. And I was like, oh my God, what did I just do? I got rid of all my deductions. So the first thing I did was start getting mortgages again. So what you have to pay attention to is the spread. Are you able to access capital in a way that is lower than the return on what you invested in?
Yes.
A automobile depreciates. There is no return on investment unless you're really smart about cars and can collect them and buy low, sell high. That's not me. But with rental real estate, and especially Greg teaches the 5 different ways to make money on a rental property, I think those odds are pretty good. A lot of people are scared of real estate because they think it's risky. But I tell you, I get great enjoyment driving by my properties and just saying hello to my money because I can see it. It doesn't move so fast like the stock market does, where one day it's crashed and the next day it's up. It was driving me crazy. So at least with real estate, it's steady Freddy. And for me, that's what wins the game.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I mean, I think there's so much knowledge wrapped up in that right there. If folks haven't heard this before, go listen to that again on replay, just that right there. Because if you can understand how debt is an asset, debt can be an asset, can also be a liability. Most people understand that, but it can be an asset. And if you have the opportunity to earn a great risk-adjusted return of, let's say, 10 to 11%, which is what JWB rental properties are producing, and you have the opportunity to borrow it at 5.25%, like Leslie did, she's excited. She can't wait to take out that debt. And if you start to train your mind that way and you practice this for years, you will wind up one day in the not too distant future, just like Leslie here, controlling your time, taking vacations, and then sharing her knowledge with everybody else.
Love it.